Right, everybody, come right on in. We'll wait a few seconds as everyone arrives into the Zoom room. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the first Friday lecture for the month of March. Today's speaker is Paul Cato, and Paul's title is Those Who Have Dared to Him Love's Praises, a symposium on Black philosophies of love. This first Friday lecture is supported by the class gift given by the 2023 graduates of the basic program of liberal education for adults. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and will be available on the Graham School YouTube channel if you want to watch it later. Also, please be aware that you will not be able to unmute your microphones during the presentation as a courtesy to our speaker. You will be able to ask questions in the chat box. You can do so at any time during the presentation. Questions that you type in the chat box, I will keep track of, and then I will pose them to Paul at the end of his lecture during our question and answer period. During the presentation itself, as I say, all will be muted except for our speaker. Paul and I will be able to see your video, but we won't be able to hear you. So if you choose to leave your video on or to turn it off, it is at your discretion. Paul's video will be spotlighted for the most part during the presentation. Consequently, the best way to view the lecture is to select speaker view instead of gallery view. Today's lecture is being sponsored by the Basic Program of Liberal Education for Adults at the University of Chicago's Graham School. My name is Kendall Sharp, and I'm the Cyril O'Hoole Chair of the Basic Program. Before I properly introduce our speaker, I'd like to say a few words about the Basic Program, the Graham School, and our upcoming courses and events. You can find links to more information in the chat box. The Basic Program is a 4-year, non-credit certificate program at the University of Chicago's Graham School of Continuing Studies. Graham offers an array of programs besides the Basic Program. Since 1946, we have offered our students a rigorous liberal arts curriculum based on the principle of direct engagement with original thinkers in their original texts. Through focused discussion and close reading, our classes provide direct encounters with some of the great works of classical and Western culture in a dedicated community of adult learners led by experienced University of Chicago educated instructors. Winter 2024 courses have been underway for a couple of months, and spring quarter courses are available for registration. Our next First Friday lecture will happen on April 5, when our speaker will be Zoe Eisenman. Zoe's title will be 3 Modes of Persuasion in Plato's Phaedo. As I mentioned before, the presentation is being recorded. The recording will be available on the Graham School YouTube channel early next week. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Paul Cato is a PhD candidate in the University of Chicago's Committee on Social Thought, and he is presently Scholar in Residence Fellow in Religion at Carleton College in Minnesota. Paul's research examines Black Americans' contributions to the practice and theorization of love, particularly those of James Baldwin. His dissertation outlines the discourse on active love, a decades-long conversation on political love between Baldwin and 20th century intellectuals. He has also investigated Black love and the love philosophies of Audre Lorde, Fyodor Dostoyevsky, and Emmanuel Levinas. In addition to his scholarship, Paul is active in the fights against racism and ableism. Now it is my pleasure to turn things over to Paul.
Can you all see that properly? Or is that showing my presenter view?
That is showing presenter view.
Oh, one day I'll get Zoom correct, maybe in 10 years or so. There's that better.
Yes.
Okay. So I want to thank you all for coming today. I'm excited to share this latest entry in my work on Black philosophies of love. This project has long roots. It traces back to high school, actually, when I was first introduced to the symposium by my Latin teacher. And I was struck at the time by a certain line that we came across as we were reading the text. And that was the fact that the Symposium, which is a dialogue Plato wrote, more literary than explicitly philosophical, that discusses the nature of love. It starts out with a line going in which the two opening figures go and raise the question, isn't it strange that of all the gods and all the figures in the world, love has received the least praises, despite all the poets having the power to go and consume and speak to his greatness? I was struck and confused by this line because it didn't seem to match what I understood society to see love as. If you turn on the radio, if you go and talk to friends or family, if you watch TV, it seems love is the most central concern and topic that everyone can think about. But here were these two figures arguing that love had hardly been explained. But then as I stepped back, I realized the discussions of love that we find in popular culture, and even when we're talking to family and friends, don't fully flesh out the complexity of love and how it operates in the world. We appreciate love, but the kind of deep hymns that Plato's participants in the symposium call for are not quite present in most everyday speech, just as the two characters brought up in the play and the dialogue. So I want to take the time to thank various support systems in my work and career. I want to thank my close friends. I want to give homage to my parents. I'd like to thank the Department of the Committee on Social Thought and the basic program, of course, and especially to thank Carleton's Religion Department and Africana Studies Department, as they've supported me over the course of the past 5 months or so here in Minnesota. I'm not quite used to the weather, but I thought Chicago was bad, but now I'm seeing there are always colder places. So with that, I think I'd like to begin. So as I mentioned before, there seems to be an inconsistency between our appreciation for love and what we seem to truly understand about it. Someone could argue, oh, if we define love too much and dissect it or overthink it, suddenly love becomes less beautiful. And someone could go and argue, okay, developing a sort of philosophy of love is unproductive. It goes and takes something we appreciate so much and makes it rational, scientific, and not particularly interesting. But if you go and read Plato's Symposium, you see here are 7 figures going and dissecting the nature of love by appreciating its beauty, going and giving speculative answers as to how it might function, where it came from, and so forth, and leaving readers to feel excited and eager to go and decipher their own understandings of love. At the same time, I think often to that quote because it seems as though there is a group of people who have never taken issue with both defining love, appreciating its glory, and inviting their readers or audience members to go think with love with them. And that group of people are African American thinkers, especially authors and literary figures like James Baldwin, but also visual artists like Bisa Butler and Kerry James Marshall, who have gone and invited us to do the same thing. The conflict and inconsistency comes from a central issue that we will constantly play with and observe in the basic program and in my home department, the Committee on Social Thought. While there is a rigorous canon and Western understandings of how to discuss topics, love comes up in Shakespeare, love comes up in Homer, love is acknowledged and recognized in spaces in the Mahabharata and such. The strange relationship that African American figures have with the canon, where in one degree they are wholly Western, if we might call it that, figures, but at the same time not wholly white and thus separated from that Western notion itself, goes and puts these kind of figures on the outside. If we had to think about a figure who is most discussed in terms of love in the 20th century, I'd argue that that person is Martin Luther King. Yet one will be hard pressed to go and look at the works of some of the great books programs around the country and find Martin Luther King's discussion of love, whether in Strength to Love or in his sermons talking about agape, to be regularly and wholly engaged in this. There are some figures like James Baldwin and bell hooks who have been appropriated into a sort of Western canon and discussion of love. But if one looks at that, that seems more to be about representational politics and diversifying the canon, as opposed to truly looking and recognizing, wow, these are mysterious and great discussions of it. Again, it's even more interesting if we think about these words that Bell Hooks offers in her book, Salvation. when she notes the fact that while contemporary Black leaders and thinkers talk about the need to have a love ethic as the foundation of struggles for Black people and self-determination, in actuality, most nonfiction writing about the Black experience does not truly address the love and does not truly address the issue of love in an extensive manner. This must go and be on our minds continuously. When we talk about love or say we need to love the world, when we go and call for love politics to be taken up and resolve whatever issues might arise, whether in the wake of George Floyd's murder, whether as we go and deal with the travesties occurring over in the Middle East, or against the people in Gaza, or if we think about past harms and horrors that have taken place. Again, while saying the love politics is necessary, that is not the same as understanding it or putting it into practice. And here is where these Black thinkers come into play. For while they show the same concern as Plato's figures to go and understand love in a transcendent way, to go to find love and figure out what it might mean to someone here in the United States, to figure out what it might meant for Socrates, to think about what it might mean all the way over in India or so on and so forth, or in the future with our children. There's something about Black discourse that changes things, and that is because Black discussions of topics like this are grounded in the social politics of African American spirits. You cannot go and discuss love in its relation to the Black life without recognizing racism, the history of Black oppression throughout the world, and the complexities about holding hope or adopting a certain Afro-pessimism, to use the term of Frank Wilderson, in the face of an oppression marking on. Whereas the figures in Plato's Symposium speak of love in mythic terms, going and talking about its origins and referencing hymns and myths from ancient Greece, Black thinkers on love have to ground it within the context of the Black everyday experience. And this gives a rich complementary aspect to go and engage with Plato. Thinking to this, we might go and operate in a sort of fundamental manner, drawing inspiration from my home department, the Committee on Social Thought. Plato might lead us with certain frameworks to think about as what love can manifest. Oh, let us go and look at a philosophy of love. Let us take each element that's offered by the discussants and consider it. But our Black thinkers that I'm going to introduce us to today go and help us take those frameworks and apply them in a context that is both social and political, that is personal and speaks to who we are as people, and at the same time gives a sort of homage and a sort of guiding direction for all of us to think about love in the future, especially as we talk to our children, whether in my Black love class that I'll be teaching in a few hours, or in the conversations my grandmother might have with her great-grandsons and so forth. This sort of translation of the mythic and the broad and the transcendent into the everyday is the marker of African American thought. And there seems to be no place where it is richer than in discussions of love. So now I'll move into a specific set of case studies. I'm going to begin with the work of Phaedrus and Phillis Wheatley. Phaedrus was one of the many young men in Athens who followed around and hung out with Socrates, his mentor and Plato's mentor. Phaedrus begins the discussion in the Symposium by raising a somewhat clear and plain discussion of love. Love is a great God. He's the eldest. He gives all control to the world. And there, because of this noblest virtue, he must go and be appreciated. When one reads the short speech of Phaedrus in the Symposium, one's liable to nod and agree and find themselves just thinking this makes sense. This is fascinating because this sort of resonance, the assumption that love is there and it's just something fundamental to believe in, seems to be taken for granted today. But then, if we step back and consider a Black thinker who also saw love that way, the great poet Phillis Wheatley, who arrived in America having been taken from West Africa as a slave, learned English through the patronage, if we can call it that, of her slave owners, and then suddenly became one of the foremost poets in early American literature, traveling all around the world, especially to England to go and discuss her findings. We see that here we go, that love is something more than we seem to understand it to be. Yes, that divinity is there, but it straps around us. And if we think about the experience of someone like Phillis Wheatley, who again was taken from Africa, exposed to Christianity, translated those Christian ideals about love, God, etc., being connected, and then showed her appreciation in the most poetic and beautiful of ways, we realize we can't take that for granted. Phillis Wheatley makes clear in her memoirs and in her conversations and shorter poems to people that without having been brought over to the United States, she would have never experienced Christianity or met with the current God that she goes and devotes herself to. And as a result, her one of her foremost poems, Thoughts on the Works of Providence, which is a deep ode to God, goes and makes a subtle point that many have gone and acknowledged as a sharp, ironic push at white people in America. We can't take God for granted. We can't take His love for granted. Yes, it is all around us in the trees and nature and so on and so forth. But when we live life and navigate it, take our life for granted, we miss that divinity. Just like Phaedrus calls us to go and appreciate God's divinity, so does Phillis Wheatley do the same 1,000 years later. And if we think about this in even more sense and think about what this could mean, perhaps seeing the love of God in the natural forces around us might make us a little bit more conscious and intentional. Over the course of the past week, the temperatures have changed here in Northfield, Minnesota at least 3 different times. In some cases, I've seen students wearing flip-flops. In other cases, they've been bundled up. And while this has been humorous for some friends of mine, it also makes me wonder, to what extent are we going and taking God's love, whatever God might manifest for someone, and its engagement with nature for granted? Wheatley just draws our attention to this fact. We have a responsibility to honor and recognize God and His greatness, again, whatever that greatness in God might be. But one thing we can all come to understand is that our life is oriented by love. We have some loving connection to nature around us, and we have a responsibility to own and take notion to it. In the case of Phaedrus, this is going and giving a speech, but Wheatley leaves it on us as individuals to figure out how best to interact with the world around us. And I say again, the fact that a slave could go and comprehend and conceive of all of this such stuff using English language, her second language, says so much about the power of Black people to be able to contribute to this discourse. Leaving her out of any kind of discourse on love seems to be a great slight to the kind of conversations that are being called for by Plato. Next, if we move to it, we see the lawyer Pausanias go and discuss love in very practical ways. One thing Plato seems to do very intentionally, both with irony and out of good sense, is to assign the kind of philosophies to the individuals as they truly are. All of the characters in Symposium, though we might not have much information on all of them, are purported to be real people. Pausanias is a lawyer and has deep understanding of the law and the nature of civic values, and he attributes this to love and this kind of behavior. Love is a guiding force of practice and how to live a life in a proper polis, in a proper city. And there's something about this, love as a guiding virtue, that just echoes and has been found throughout Western society, especially in the case in the United States of the sort of love-based duty that the founding fathers attributed. If one goes and reads diaries from James Madison or reads the letters Madison wrote to Thomas Jefferson, we'll get a sense of the kind of homosociality and friendship that goes and guides this aspect. That love is a nature between two, that when we talk about lovers, it is not simply operating for the sense of sensual satisfaction or pleasure, but so that people can grow and be good citizens in the world. Fascinatingly, bell hooks, Black feminist, critical pedagogue, deep influential thinker in the latter end of the 20th century, who passed 3 years ago, went and thought very similarly about love in her trilogy of books on the topic. These books included Salvation, Love and Black People. She wrote a book, real cool, about Black men's engagement with it. And she wrote books about Black women's engagement, multiple ones. But her most well-known book falls outside that trilogy and is all about love, New Visions. Every time I tell someone I study love, regardless of their age, someone mentions, oh, I've read Bell Hooks's book, All About Love. And it seems in some ways she might be the foremost philosopher of love of our current moment, at least in the United States, and especially with Gen Z and millennials. And it's fascinating to see that she looks at love very similar to this ancient Greek lawyer. Love is about an action and it's about a practice. It's not simply feeling something for other people. She goes and distinguishes love from care and regard and desire and so forth. For her, if love does not operate in a virtuous way through virtuous actions, it has no use in society. It's something willful, intentional, something chosen to be done. And she attributes this to being the reason why people hesitate to think about it, or why people even hesitate to engage in it. This sort of fear that comes with taking responsibility and being intentional does not operate within the sort of chivalric visions of love that we have now, or even when some of the Christian notions of love being guided almost entirely by God's inspiration. Making love a form of responsibility becomes all the more complicated if we think, in the ways true to bell hooks' feminism, that all of our actions and practices are situated within the sociopolitics of our society. One cannot go in love with the great intentionality bell hooks says without being mindful of their gender, their wealth, their class, their privilege. And this puts people in a very particular situation because it requires that self-reflection is done. And fascinatingly, Plato's lawyer makes the same admission over and over again. The lover must go and know themselves so they can figure out how to foster with their beloved a sense of good practice and virtue in the city. That's why we have rules and laws about love, he says, to go make sure we behave properly. Hooks is more skeptical about bringing in the government to create norms and practices for love. She has deep faith in the willfulness that can come from us, but one cannot deny the similarities in that framework of love as a practice. It works well, especially if we might think about how to educate people better on how love should work. Hooks goes and makes the suggestion, which I agree with wholeheartedly, that maybe love should be integrated into school curriculums, especially in early childhood education, so that people become better lovers by the time they grow older. But this idea scares people, just as bell hooks attributes, because to go and live a proper, willful, intentional life through love means accepting self-reflection that people are not quite ready to go handle. Next, we go and we speak to Anaximaxis, the doctor in Plato's Symposium. While he goes and in a very self-righteous way finds a way to make love in his discussion of love about his art of medicine, to go talk about how the doctors are some of the foremost experts in the topic of love, we do find one very useful and wholly applicable sense of what love could be in his framing of love as a form of harmony. In his understanding, love provides a balance between two excesses, whether the things are the overly good or the overly bad. He attributes and argues that there are two senses of love, a good love that desires good things, a bad love that desires bad things. And is that good eros that comes and sets a balance between desires that might be too far on either end. This sort of harmony, this love as a mediation is seen throughout society, throughout the world. And we see forms of love like that appear in Hindu doctrine. We see it come up in Africanist spaces. And we see it reappear in the West in the forms of Stoic philosophy, though in many cases, the term love used by those philosophies aren't exactly the same mirroring that we get when we see the eros discussed in Plato's Symposium. But if we remain mindful of this discussion of fundamental topics, the love does seem relevant and pertinent in all cases. Fascinatingly, we can go and see the work of love serving as harmonious when we look to Ralph Ellison, one of the greatest novelists in American history, and the producer of one of the great works of all literature of all time. His text, Invisible Man, has gone and perplexed people since it was first published in 1953, 1954, because there is such great irony going on in it. On the one hand, if someone reads the book, they will find a hilarious situation and start laughing. Only pages later, they'll go and see something horrible having to do with racism or sexism. And then they'll come back and one will end the chapter. How am I supposed to think about this? Was this man the invisible man who was struggling to go and deal with racism? Is his life tragic or is it comic? Ellison would argue, drawing on a blues aesthetic, that it's both, and that this is what defines African American experiences, going and finding harmony between two dramatic either ends. And at the end of the novel, when the invisible man finally comes to recognize that after going underground and to hide from racism, he has internalized racism and rendered himself invisible, going and taken the way in which he felt alienated and isolated by white people overlooking his needs. We see him come and realize this with regards to love. I sell you no phony forgiveness. I'm a desperate man, but too much of your life will be lost, its meaning lost, unless you approach it as much through love as through hate. So I approach it through division. I denounce and I defend and I hate and I love. In an era of great social media discourse, we find it is so easy to go one way or the other. You find a response in a posting that you disagree with and you write a comment to push against it. You find one that you agree with and give it a like and a thumbs up. And if there's one that perplexes you that finds itself in the middle, you're likely to go and scroll past it. Ellison views this as an improper way to go and function in society. As he would believe it, just like Eryximachus, we are always pulled in either direction by the good and the bad, especially in terms what's good for our spirit. Love serves as a mediating means by which we can go balance that out and foster that harmony. One might say, okay, this is normal. Many people go and talk about love as a healing factor. It makes sense for a doctor to say this, and fine, what does Ellison have to add to this? The key is Ellison's great faith in democracy. Those excesses, the hate and the bitterness that described, or the deep despair that might come from racism, are overcome when we learn to use love, to accept the fact that despite it being difficult, despite the world not making quite sense, we can go and engage with other people, especially strangers, and foster a democratic society in which, by engaging and practicing love, we can mediate our excesses, talk to people as they are, meet them where they are, and foster a sense of society in which needs are made and taken consent for. This will be a long process. Democracy is not pretty. Again, it's marked by people who are desperate and have watched too much of their life lost. But this faith in democracy and love as a form of mediation takes Eryximachus's great ode to his own medicine and his own practice as a doctor and brings it down to the level of social politics and makes it reassurance. I do not know a single individual who has read through all 500 pages of Invisible Man and not come out with some seeming understanding and new humility about who they are and how they can function in the world. Every individual I've met who has gone and processed that book has come out believing in love even just a little bit, no matter how nationalistic or militaristic or pessimistic their ideas on love might be, which proves a point. If Ellison could go and write a love story to this invisible man who had struggled all his life, then clearly he pulled us down by finding some kind of harmony for even the most dramatic of us, especially including 15-year-old me who made the mistake of trying to understand this book. We go next to Plato's most famous discussion in the Symposium, and that's that of Aristophanes, the comic poet. Aristophanes was a major critic of Plato's mentor Socrates, and mocked him in several of his discourses reportedly, as well as in his plays. As Plato understood it, according to Socrates, part of Socrates' ultimate reason for going and being convicted of corrupting the youth had to do with Aristophanes' misrepresentation of Socrates as someone scheming and sadistic and unproductive with the way in which he loved other individuals. Thus, when Plato goes and inserts him into this dialogue, he assigns Aristophanes the most absurd of situations. He has deep hiccups and cannot give his speech for much of the night. And although none of them have gone and drank, and there's the sense that he drank too much the previous night and suffering from some kind of excesses the night before. But fascinatingly, despite Aristophanes being made out to look like a fool, his speech, in which he argues that originally human beings were androgynous and had 4 arms, 4 legs, both genitalia, 2 sets of genitalia, and 2 faces, which were then gone, and because of human beings' strength, were sliced in half. And thus, as a result, human beings are going and looking for their other half to resolve and to turn back into that position, which you see here in this picture from this vase. This has become one of the most central aspects of the Symposium carried over. When people think about Platonic love, they often imagine soulmates coming together in this way. This was not necessarily Plato's foremost idea coming from the document, but we see that it has lasted the longest. This idea about coming over and finding your soulmate resonates deeply with the people, and especially plays a fundamental role in our contemporary understanding of monogamy, marriage, and the like. On the other hand, we see similar sentiments of soulmates and love and a finding effort in restoring whole in Toni Morrison. But in this artist, winner of the Nobel Prize and one of the fiercest advocates of an African-American literature not dependent on reactions to whiteness, The idea she presents is that of a thick love. The quote comes from a scene in her masterwork, Beloved, in which the protagonist, Sethi, is going around and interacts with her lover, Paul D. Her lover, a former slave like her, goes and gets upset in the most stereotypical ways in a that men might do in a Toni Morrison novel, presuming they know more than the women in their life and scolding them from something. In a typical Morrisonian way, Sethi responds very visually, "You know what? You don't understand my sense of love." Paul D says to her, "Your love is too thick," implying he can't handle all the emotion she provides to him, that it's overwhelming, distracting, and he can't live his life as a man. To which case his lover responds emphatically, "Too thick? Thin love ain't no love at all." When came across this passage, there's a large smiley face in my copy of the book, and I come across it and I start to laugh because there seems to be an assumption on Morrison's part that love should be excessive, it should be dramatic, it should be intense. Now, this doesn't go and excuse and justify over the top behaviors that we associate with sentimentality. But what Morrison seems to assume and seems to imply, just like Aristophanes, is that the process of experiencing love is an intense, difficult one. It's not it's not a pleasant perspective. It's not something to give us sentimental joy or make us feel good. Depiction on love coming from Disney movies or on reality TV are not useful. And we can think of this guy given to the very fact of the title of the book. Beloved takes its title from the name of the young girl of the baby that Seth has to kill in order to go and protect her child from becoming a slave, being born into slavery. And to think that this child whose life was taken from them has a name associated taken from the fact that their parent did an act of love, that to have their life taken is an act of love of the ultimate source. It is an example of thick love, goes and puts ponderous to it as to what we might think of by finding our soulmates. Perhaps we need not draw upon language that we're typical of when discussing love, a caution that Bell Hooks also reminds us of in her later works. Perhaps we need not find a straight partner. Perhaps we can go and not look for our person, quote unquote. Maybe we'll take a lifetime to go, or maybe we'll have multiple partners. Maybe we'll come to learn that our partner might be ourselves, and that small intimate gatherings with friends can go and substitute and offer coming together and feeling our whole selves. By freeing ourselves from a sense of norms as to what love should look like, norms which could not apply to the slaves that Morrison describes in Beloved, and maybe perhaps we can live more productively and more satisfactorily. If Paul D and Setha could go and experience love despite being slaves and then having to deal with the difficulties that come afterwards, then perhaps we too can go and figure out how to go and experience love despite the difficulties we face. Because I find it hard to believe that the depictions of love offered by Morrison can't go and resonate in 2024. Next, we'll look to the speech of Agathon. Symposium takes place after Agathon, the poet dramatist, has won an award for his play. They agree not to drink, and Agathon, feeling so much confidence after winning, goes and gives a magical speech about love. His speech is less a discussion of who love is or how he functions, less a philosophical overview of how love operates, and more a simple praise to love's glory. Love comes as a very masculine figure here. There's an assertion of a number of qualifiers that speak to what a human being would be like: virtue, temperance, bravery. And we go and understand love in this way. It seems something active, something that has potential to be taken up and resonated with. If love is virtuous, if love is something temperate, if love is something courageous, then perhaps I can go and imitate these things. According to Agathon, if my students come to class after being exhausted all day, having stayed up late trying to finish their comprehensive exams, and still have the spark in their eye that they're willing to go and discuss Toni Morrison's Sula, one of the most difficult books I've ever taught, then that virtuous, brave, temperate sort of love that I see radiating from them is just in line with what Agathon is saying. Fascinatingly, we'll go and see this in the work of someone whose social political context is so far removed from Agathon. Here, these words come from Dr. Martin Luther King. Him going and equating agape, not eros, but times have changed because of Christian influence, goes and talks about God's love as a central force going and setting the world in order. Here too, Martin Luther King describes love with these qualifiers, talking about how, yes, he orders life and orders the world, but does so with some anthropological features of bravery and force and so forth that make love less some metaphysical force and something more personal that we can relate to. Somehow, a deep, devoted monotheistic Christian can resonate with someone living in a polytheistic times. And I think Agathon and Martin Luther King's resonances show us deeply how the writings and ideas of Black thinkers operate fully in conversation with that of thinkers from the past, and it's Plato's discussion and frameworks for love. Next, we'll move to the penultimate discussion, and that is of Socrates and James Baldwin. When Socrates gives his speech, he tells us that it is not a direct understanding of love himself, but a speech he heard, a discussion he heard when talking to Diotima, a mistress who, a mysterious woman who understands the magic and the art of love. She tells Socrates that love is not quite a god in the way that the other speakers have said, but is more so a divine spirit that falls somewhere in between mortality and immortality. She says and argues that love mediates between the two worlds of the divine and the human groundedness, and that it goes and operates, and to quote her directly, "For God mingles not with man, but through love. And because wisdom is a most beautiful thing, and love is of the beautiful, love is also a philosopher, or lover of wisdom." Somehow, by not possessing full wisdom, by not possessing full beauty, love, a thing that can also be painful and ugly at times, while also appearing somewhat attractive at other times, being something that mediates between the good and the bad, between the earthly and the divine. Love comes and goes, and it shatters our notions of love being some sentimental, beautiful, perfect thing. Fascinatingly, this is a common theme within Black discussions of love. Not so much because love in and of itself is seen as something bad, but because these individuals looking at love are operating and seeing its operation within a social political politics marked by oppression and disregard for themselves as Black people, especially those among them who might be Black and queer, as in the case of James Baldwin, or Black and women, as in this case of Bell Hooks and Toni Morrison and the like. Baldwin would argue a similar understanding. He sees love as a central force orienting the world, but as he describes it, love's divinity is not dissimilar to Martin Luther King's divinity, in which the two are in which love is divine because love is a form of our anthropomorphic Christian God. No, instead, love is a binding force that goes and derives the ways in which human beings connect to one another and navigate the world. In one conversation, in one speech, he argues that if you love someone and they don't love you back, you'll die, because as he understands it, love is some interdependent force that connects us all and keeps us grounded in life. And at the same time, because love is this active force, because it is difficult, because it is at times ugly and harsh, it pushes us to grow, it pushes us to advance and move ourselves up. In this way, we find another conjunction with Diotima's speech. As she educates Socrates, one must go and practice the art of love by going and proceeding on love as though it's a ladder. First, you will love someone's body for their beautiful beauty, then you will get to know them better and love them for their personality, and so on. Things will proceed up until you understand the beauty that radiates from their mind and the ideas that they're capturing and understanding in full. While James Baldwin, who is not a philosopher, does not offer such a systematic account, his various metaphors about love providing growth, about love helping you change, about transformation, go and resonate with this idea of the ladder of love. I'd like to go and finish on one final note by talking about one of the strangest speeches in Plato's Symposium. As I mentioned earlier, the discussants at the drinking party have decided we will not make this a typical drinking party, whereas at typical symposiums, there was much festivities and people partied and so forth. In this case, they all agreed to abstain from drinking alcohol and getting intoxicated. But Alcibiades, one of the most attractive, popular men in Athens, comes in at one point and bursts into the party drunken. He interrupts the mediated, harmonious, spiritual kind of discussions of love that we found earlier in the speech, in the text. And rather than giving a praise to love, he goes and gives a praise to Socrates himself. One key aspect about Alcibiades' speech is he gives us a depiction of what it is like to experience love. Rather than talking about love remotely as some god far removed that we give honor to, Alcibiades discusses what it means to have that love affect your life. He focuses on Socrates, speaking the ways in which Socrates has rebuffed him. And in one of the most heartbreaking and tragically moving scenes that I have found in Western literature, he tells us, Socrates is the only man in the world who has made me feel shame. I think it would be happier if he were dead. And yet, I know if he dies, I'll be even more miserable. I can't live with him and I can't live without him. What can I do? There's great irony in this statement, and it goes and speaks to love's boundaries. On the one hand, those of us who have been in love know that whether it's with a family member, a friend, or with a romantic partner, one puts oneself at great risk of feeling harm. There might be moments in which, because we love them, we draw deep resentment and even wish bad things upon them. But at the same time, we worry that we won't be able to go and live without them in their situations. Such is the reason we see such dramatic behavior and why so many tragic situations involve love. Slowly, the notion of fundamental text has broadened in my department. And after thinking about this and thinking about who best to go and put Alcibiades in conversation, I realized there was no better figure than Billie Holiday. There's a deep blues-like aspect to Alcibiades' speech. Holiday is understood as the Great Lady Day and her designation within the Great American Songbook, took each song that she engaged with and offered a sweet resonation with it. At least half of her songs are tragic and sad, talking about heartbreak, losing one's home, and even the songs that are about joy, songs like Summertime from the Gershwins' Porgy and Bess, are sang with an irony in which case they sound sad. Songs of heartbreak are sang joyfully. Songs about joy are sang with a bitter sense of despair. And this blues-like aspect, which again we see resonate with Ellison, in which the comic and the tragic are brought together so we remember the complexities of life, seems to speak perfectly to what Alcibiades was discussing.
All of me, why not?
Paul, you just went mute.
I'm no good without you. Take my I'm going to lose them. Take my arms, I'll never use them. Your goodbye left me with eyes that cry. How can I go on, dear, without you? You took the best, so why take the rest? Baby, take all of me.
I hope that the clip from All of Me went through, but and if it did, I think this resonance will be spoken out. If someone hears that song, a song about having one's heart broken entirely to the point in which you want to die. However, if you listen to this song, you can't help but tap your feet and in some cases even get up and want to dance. And the idea that Billie Holiday can go and take such a depressing topic about the fact that love will drive us to the want of death, but still have us enjoy the song so much that we find enjoyment out of it, speaks to that side of notion of the dynamic that we find governing and operating in love. Yes, we can sing love's praises. Yes, love can be a great thing that Hooks, Wheatley, Baldwin, Morrison, and so forth all give praises to. But Billie offers us this perspective, understanding that no matter what, This love will be difficult, challenging, and at times we might even lose faith of it. But there's something about that irony, there's something about that blues-like inconsistency that gives us groundedness in the world around us. We're at a position now where we now just need to decide how we will go and participate in discourse on love. As we leave here today, we can go and join the participants in Plato's Symposium, go and join Baldwin and the rest who have gone and discussed love in such complex ways, and think about how love matters to us. But at the same time, if we do so, we must remember that there is a particular contribution that African-American philosophers on love bring. And that is the fact that every discussion of love they offer is grounded here in the real world context in which social, political, and cultural differences affect our ability to do so. One will always have to inquire and doubt and look skeptically upon assumptions that one has made about love. And in doing so, one will grow as a lover, to cite James Baldwin. One will become more intentional, to note Hooks. One will go and feel love more rawly and with the blues-like sensuality, to go and speak back to Holiday. And the list goes forward. The one thing we must recognize is to do so means great fear. And again, in a moment in 2024, when it seems like all things are being scripted and handed to us, in which we should go and remove for ourselves further and further from each other, it seems like love and praising it are more necessary than ever. But again, to heed the warnings of the openings, to heed the warnings of Phaedrus at the beginning of Plato's Symposium, we need to be mindful that many people have not truly praised love. They've praised desire, they've praised warmth. So it is on us to be intentional and to go and draw lessons from both these Black thinkers and from the people who provide us from our frameworks. Love truly will save the world, but in making sure that that happens falls on us. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Let me appear. We have a number of questions, and let's see here. I'm harvesting the last question, which just came in. The first one comes from Ray Lucchese, and Ray asks, or actually it's more of a comment, social media seems more effective at boosting hate rather than love. Not sure Ellison's approach or Eric Simicus's approach to life plays well with social media today.
My response to that has to be to acknowledge yes, but I have to go and speaking from working with members of Generation Z, the most social media minded generation we've ever seen. They do not go and look at their social media discourse in the abstract. They bring it with them when they do talk to people. And many of them interact with strangers over social media. So it seems in a strange way in which Ellison is the perfect antidote from that kind of social media isolation. I've seen students come to me deeply upset by things they've seen on TikTok, have a conversation with me to go process it, and go talk to friends in real life or even to family members to go process under what they've had. Oftentimes a response that someone will have after seeing something upsetting on social media is maybe to push back, but that's what Ellison wants us to do, to have that talk with strangers, so long as we then go and mediate our rebuff by talking to someone we love. We process and learn to understand strangers by going and seeing something that harms us and then talking to, say, my best friend Michael, or processing it with my friend Janelle. These kind of understandings go and allow us to be active citizens, just in the same way that Madison and the founding fathers knew that we had to have some kind of space to talk out our differences. Ellison sees that as a practice of love, but we can't go and have that unless we are willing to face the messiness that comes through. That's the reason that Invisible Man has to come out of his hole at the end of the book. He realizes it's not enough to speak in the abstract or to retreat just so that he won't feel hate. The hate and resentment he feels towards society is always in his heart, but he needs to go out, interact with strangers, including those who harm him, so that he can balance it out with love and find a middle ground. That's what true democracy is in Ralph Ellison's perspective.
Woo! Thank you, Paul. The next question is from James Shaw, who asks, does division mean finding a golden mean, or does it mean discernment, dividing off the ignorant and incorrect from the correct and the true. Of course, finding the truth is complex, itself requiring discernment and dividing. Is not love to confront what is wrong and unjust?
What I find fascinating about a question like this, and what Ellison might respond to, since the notion of division seems to go back towards him, is that there's no need to go and find the truth of love in that sort of way. And I'm liable, and as I continue to study love more and more, I find myself more likely to go and subscribe to this thought too. For Ellison, because love is a means of practice, the division is not so much going and finding distinctions as it is going and understanding, okay, I need to divide up these overwhelming aspects of my life, either too much hate or too much apathy, and love brings that to a sort of mean going in that regard. It's not so much a means, love is not so much a means of understanding the world better, but of navigating it well. This is not typical of many philosophies of love. If one goes and reads discussions of love that come up in Aristotle as he's going and talking about philia, friendship, love, or if one looks at any of the discussions of love written in Roman poetry and the like, no, there's a desire to discern it and understand better. And that philosophical bracketing that you offered is of quite usefulness. But it doesn't apply to this sort of tradition of Black philosophy of love, because that concern is not there to them. The love has to go and emancipate them. So division here means dividing up those kind of overwhelming burdens that come with us as human beings. Invisible Man makes clear he spent all his life trying to be a philosopher, trying to understand the world, but he spent too much time, and as a result, he wasted his youth. So for him, division is pushing back and dividing against that urge to go and intellectualize the world. He needs to live it and meet people on a stranger level.
Thanks, Paul. The next question comes from EC, who asks, how do we meet people where they are when there are various, quote, intensities, close quote, in expression of love? How do we show up in our full expressions of love while making room for others to show up in theirs? Maybe it cannot be fully reconciled, but continually worked on and co-created, ...
I would say you answered the question with that last part. Again, to go and keep using the Ellison metaphor, at one point in recent, I can't remember what year, the Museum of Contemporary Art collected all of the Gordon Parks illustrations, photographs that Gordon Parks, the great Black photographer, took with Ralph Ellison. They recreated scenes from Invisible Man all throughout Harlem and New York, took pictures in black and white to recreate the scenes. And when I saw the exhibit, I suddenly understood the books in ways I didn't understand. The Invisible Man, the Black protagonist of the story and the narrator, chooses to go underground to go because he is tired of trying to meet people where they are. But as he notes by the end of towards the beginning, at the end of the prologue, his behavior is thus because he has spent all his time looking for answers from other people. Love, as he should truly behave it, means, again, going out, seeing where they are and seeing where oneself is. It might mean conflict, it might need to require stepping back at times, but it's that constant pull to go and divide, to go meet and find harmony. It's not going to be simple, but going in this kind of collaboration, that's what fosters the democratic spirit. The question comes, and this is where it gets complicated. What if the person you're meeting does not have any interest in meeting you, being met where they are, or so forth? Ellison's claim is no, the harmony is always possible in there, but one might need to say, okay, this person is just far too much a stranger for me to do the job of explaining everything. So why not go show them grace at that regard, bite my tongue and show division in that regard to push down whatever hate might come up in my heart, meet them there, and then let someone else go and foster them to a democratic pole that is even more useful. A key aspect that Ellison wants to make clear is we are not in this alone. Democracy means that there is a whole society around us of many participants. The Invisible Man falls into despair because by the end of his time in the living above ground, he has really come to believe he is all by himself. But as a result, he hides underground. And in Gordon Parks' exhibit, one sees the last scene of the last photograph in the collection with the Invisible Man raising the manhole cover above his head. A slight, not very obvious smile is up there because he realizes himself, wow, I am the one who put myself underground. I'm the one who rendered invisibility. I need not go and stay away from everyone in the world because not everyone I've encountered has truly harmed me. The system has, structures have, certain mean individuals certainly have. But if he goes and reduces his life and his interaction with society to those things, he's embracing white supremacy and internalized racism. He is more than his encounters with harmful people. He includes his potential encounters with good people and so forth. Again, the blues-like irony of the book is that there are as many joyful scenes in the book as there are tragic ones. The one looks at the cover and is immediately going to assume this is going to be a sad book about racism, and I'll leave it with great despair. One student told me he hated the epilogue because it went and didn't seem to jive with the rest of the novel, to which I thought, well, Ralph Ellison was inspired by Dostoyevsky, and that's a constant claim people make about every major Dostoyevsky novel. Why is love going and saving these people at the end of the book? That just doesn't seem right.
That's very interesting. So I have questions for you about Dostoevsky now, but I'll stay with the queue of questions from our participants. The next one comes from L.R. Cross, who asks, can you comment on how fawning or praising an oppressor, loving the unlovable, is or is not love? For example, oppressed people can see the humanity in the oppressor, not the other way. Is this love or keeping the system of oppression in operation? Thank you.
I think bell hooks hits on this best. The assumption, the reason why African Americans are so convicted to a certain idea of love, or have been so committed to an idea of love, is that throughout society, love has been seen as one of the fundamental aspects of what it means to be a human being. And to justify the dehumanization of African Americans so as to rationalize why they could be enslaved and not be treated as full people, the idea has been pushed through that African Americans somehow do not love properly. As Hooks and Baldwin would see it, no, Black people, oppressed people can love the most, they can love their oppressors. So as a result, demonstrating love for the oppressor is not so much going and fawning over them or giving up, as much as it is just going and validating and performing one's humanity. If Martin Luther King and his followers could go and cross the Selma Bridge and then come to find themselves assaulted, that was probably one of the scenes in which that most humanized the civil rights movement for people. And it showed them, wow, this group of Black people truly do love themselves. They truly do love society. They truly do love America enough to push for it. And so this aspect in which we go and love the oppressor, I think it truly is an opportunity to go inspire. Perhaps the oppressor might not go and learn their lesson, might not join us in the effort to go love. But a thing I think about a lot, especially given my mother as an early childhood educator, children watching you go and show love for those who are different will adopt that as a proper behavior themselves. If we think about it in some ways, children are just born to love. They go and hug people they don't know. They go and hug and show love and affection to people that are close to them. Sometimes they even go show love and affection to toys and things that they're playing with. But later, as people get older, we're given rules about what is and isn't appropriate with love. By showing unabashed love for the oppressor, we send a message to young children. You can love anyone, and that love will go and sustain yourself as a human being. Perhaps even the tragedy and pain that comes when we love the oppressor is a reminder just of how human we are and an affirmation that we deserve to be here. Yes, the oppressor must improve and grow, but that is on them. We're providing them the opportunity to do so, and with a model. This is something found throughout all of the figures I've mentioned earlier.
Thanks, Paul. The next question comes from Jerry Ree, who asks, I really liked the direction you're taking your project. Would you say love is weak or strong? How about your project? Is it weak or strong in order to move the peoples?
I have to say love is strong. If I say love is weak, I'll be laughed at by my close friends who are watching me here today. I think that strength, however, is just more complicated than we can understand, and that's part of the mystery that goes and marks us. To go and show the strength, I see someone in the chat board that says loving the oppressor. No. Well, if we take an intersectional perspective on how people live, drawing it from Audre Lorde, bell hooks, James Baldwin, etc., I might be oppressed in one regard as a Black man. I might be oppressed as someone who's disabled and queer, but I have a great amount of privilege given my educational background. I have a great amount of privilege living here in the United States. And if going through, I have to go and acknowledge the ways in which Black women have loved me despite participating in part my participation in patriarchy, the ways in which I learned about my queerness by queer people showing love to me when I identified as heterosexual. And this is a sign of why love is strong. What does it say for the Black women at Swarthmore to have put up with me making terrible jokes when I first entered college, calling me out on that when they had they knew nothing about me, but then showing faith so that they are some of the closest people in my life for the rest of, and they will be for the rest of my life. If this isn't strength, I don't know what love is. And if that doesn't count as loving the oppressor, I don't know what is either. Because again, my foolishness at age 18 and the stupid things I said to women and so on and so forth, having come from an elite, ritzy, all boys school, meant that I was operating as an oppressor in some regard. Now, there's a difference, however, between loving, as in hugging someone who's about to shoot you, and loving by going and dealing with an abusive, toxic person. That's not what I'm talking about. That's not the thick love Toni Morrison is engaging. If anything, thick love in those cases might mean walking away so that that individual is forced to think about themselves. Sometimes love means stepping away. Sometimes we need to give space to our children after they've been behaving improperly out of love. But no, love is always strong. And if it wasn't strong, there would not be a need for us to constantly draw to it. Something about its elusiveness goes and makes it strong enough that we all want it. If it was weak, we wouldn't be talking about it here today.
Thanks, Paul. And sort of in keeping with the previous question, Mavis Keepin asks, how would Socrates understand, quote, turn the other cheek? Close quote.
I think one, he would go and appreciate the irony of the statement, and he would relish over that and go and try to operate in some regard. I think for him, a notion like turn the other cheek, this Christian doctrine of going and accepting harm, would be okay in as much as the practice of love that he and Diotima operate goes and leads up to up the ladder of love and offers wisdom. I think James Baldwin is a good interlocutor in this case, because James Baldwin talks about the ways in which all of the ways in which he's been harmed and hurt by love allowed him to be a better lover and to understand the world better, to reach a certain kind of place of going up there. We could say to Socrates, turning the other cheek, that's one of the difficulties of rising on that ladder of love. It's a funny metaphor. It doesn't quite make full sense, but we can go and see it as part of connecting with people because it goes and speaks to our responsibility to take up the progress and push. At the same time, because it comes from a Christian doctrine, it would not fully resonate with him, and I think he would be skeptical to go follow any kind of monotheistic understanding of how love should operate. But I do think it resonates with the idea of the ladder of love and practicing the art of love.
Thanks for that. That's interesting. Oh, before I read the next question from Kristen Bloomer, I just wanted to say that a particular thing that I loved and I didn't quite expect from your talk was how you used Plato's Symposium like as a tool, which I really appreciated. That was a great use of it. The next question comes from Kristen Bloomer, who asks, "Thank you for such a beautiful and inspiring lecture, Paul. So rich. I wonder, it seems in your lecture you do the important work of tracing similarities of notions of love within Plato's Symposium and within the work of Black thinkers. This is obviously very important work in connecting Black thinkers to the Western canon. Are there important differences you would like to lift up as we part?"
Oh, there are definitely important differences. But last night when I was putting together the final touches on the presentations, I realized I would be doing a disservice to the people I'm speaking about to go and not draw that kind of connection. So what comes to me is that identifying those differences is a next step in the project that I want to undertake. We need to go and acknowledge that everyone in Symposium is coming from a position of great privilege. They're getting, in the narrative of Symposium, servants and slaves are coming up and giving them food and so forth. They've just come back from a large bourgeois theater competition. Alcibiades is one of the most prominent citizens in all of Athens. The list goes on and on. So there's something of a comfort for them to sit and lounge around and talk about this. I think if we go and consider the context in which, say, Bell Hooks had to go and discover her insights on love, which came from abusive relationships and from working with poor students in Appalachia. We think about the context in which James Baldwin, who was deeply poor growing up and had very complicated issues with his queerness and so forth. And suddenly the discussions come up. But I think those differences operate in somewhat of a talking to strangers type way, reminiscent of the Ellison. Because when we put in conversation, yes, there are differences, but they offer us ways of reimagining rather than going and dismissing Plato. I think one vital thing about the Social Committee on Social Thought's approach to using fundamental texts is to see similarities and differences as a way to go and further understand some ideas that make us human, rather than to go and play into a more identity politics trope about let's go separate the West and the canon from African American thought. That's where the differences come in. We go and notice the differences so we can see similarities and learn from those differences and come have a bit richer understandings of love. Instead of going and giving mythic hymns and overly sentimental discussions about love as a god, why not talk about those themes in a way that's socially constructed and situated? I need to know about how love operates in a patriarchal setting so I don't practice those things again. When I become a father, I need to understand how love should be practiced between strangers so I can tell my children to love more productively. And in times of heartbreak, I need to go and understand, okay, you feel just like Alcibiades bursting in, not understanding why your heartbreak has come in. I will confess to having read that quote many times after painful moments with past lovers and so forth. But again, thinking to Billie Holiday, I need to think about this fact that no, I'm not rich enough to be like Alcibiades, sobbing and drinking and so forth. I have responsibility, so why not listen to all of me, push through the pain of the heartache and understand it through a blues-like setting that goes and helps me last on, just like my Black ancestors invoked the blues to survive in the South themselves.
Thank you, Paul. The next question comes from Jenna Sarkio, who asks, thanks so much for sharing your work on this, Paul. Your discussion of Phillis Wheatley got me wondering about the relationship between enslavement and love. Bondage and enslavement are so often used as metaphors for the experience of love, particularly prevalent, e.g., in Roman erotic elegy. Is there something about the experience and framework of enslavement that encourages a certain kind of reflection on or relationship to love?
When engaging with Wheatley's work, there's a difficulty, and this has been talked about by many scholars who work with her. The thought of a young girl being brought over as a slave from Africa brings tragedy to any of the work she produces, despite her brilliance being evident through it. She's been given a new language, a new religion has been forced upon her. So there's always a strange relationship with reading her work. I can appreciate the beauty, but at times I'm wondering, is this really her beauty, or is this something imposed upon her by her masters, especially given the fact that she was trotted around the world and people went and were really curious as to whether or not she really could have written the poems and so forth. I think that's why the poem about Providence goes and speaks to me, because it seems as though she's going and offering her understanding of God in the world that has nothing to do with her enslavement and so forth. She's going and saying, wow, there is something transcendent in the world that brings meaning to my life. She might have seen that before she was brought over to the United States. And so going and finding love operating in that way, I don't see love as in bondage. I don't see love as enslavement in her vision of it. And that's somewhat inspirational, to not think about love in some pained way, like when we watch a soap opera or see whatever latest reality TV shows and depicts it. At the same time, Wheatley makes clear that love is not easy. She talks in the poem elsewhere about how sad it is that human beings are not giving adequate appreciation to love, that they're not fulfilling their responsibility. So she's not sentimentalizing it, but there's something that goes where she's saying, yes, there's social political context in which love has to operate, but love itself transcends this, and the issues that we see on a social political level and many of the metaphors we use for love, for example, slavery and bondage, don't quite get at what love truly is, and it's our responsibility as human beings to get at it better. She was a deeply devout Christian, and in some ways she writes fascinating passages about how she appreciates having been brought over here because it led her to God, which again, these are the difficult passages that many scholars have reflected on in their relationship to it. But this eternal God, this transcendent love, is something that's not marked by bondage so much as responsibility. And if we're going to use more Wheatley's perspective on this, then we do need to think about it in new terms. It's easy to go and throw terms about bondage and the like into discussions of love, especially when we go and think about its the patriarchal history of marriage and other heteronormative ideas about how relationships should operate.
Thanks, Paul. The final question comes from, let's see, Kendall Sharp, who asks, what did you mean a while ago when you said something about the epilogues in Dostoyevsky? And also, because perhaps this is related, did the phrase and concept of active love, did that come from Dostoyevsky?
Yes, active love came from Dostoyevsky, and it was just fascinating to me that there's a trio of African-American writers, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, and James Baldwin, who were all influenced by Dostoyevsky. Two of them picked up on Dostoyevsky's faith and love, whereas Richard Wright focused more on the despair that Dostoyevsky illustrated in his novels. Given Dostoyevsky's writing in the latter half of the 19th century Russia, amidst all the political conflict, each of his novels goes and addresses some philosophical political issue, whether it have to do with his sadness at seeing the Slavic heritage and traditions of Russia being pushed against by French thinkers and the West, or whether it had to do with the slow de-Christianization of his country and so forth. But because he had such a deep, rich, Slavic Orthodox understanding of God and his presence everywhere in a way that is distinct from Western understandings of love, in which God is somewhat removed from us, Dostoyevsky had no doubt in his mind that love would go and save. So when people from the West, and when I say the West, I mean Western Europe and the United States and so forth, read Dostoyevsky, we all often open the book expecting it to be nothing about death, nothing but death and harm and horror, because that's how he's been presented to us. But this man was a deep believer. He said his whole understanding of the world was shaped by the Gospel of John, which equates God with love wholeheartedly. So at the end of every Dostoyevsky novel, major novel, someone gets redeemed through love. But again, this just doesn't match our expectations for what Dostoyevsky represents. This idea of active love, the love that's practiced and pulled through, we see it fascinatingly in this tradition of Black philosophers who engage with love. And I'm still curious as to what extent, say, does Morrison go and draw from him, or not at all? Did she come to this independently? To what extent might bell hooks have gone and engaged with this and so forth? Or were they drawing from, say, James Baldwin and their influence that way? But Baldwin explicitly did draw from from Dostoyevsky's vision of love. And it's clear there's some resonance and analogousness between Ellison and him.
Thanks, Paul. And that, eerily on time for an ending. Now we have a practice which I'm doing the tech part too, where I'm going to let all participants unmute themselves so that you can hear applause. And I believe everyone should be unmuted. Try it out, everybody. See if you can applaud.
Whoa.
Wonderful.
Great work.
That's all.
Good job, Paul.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job, Paul.
Thank you.
So good.
All right, I'm going to press stop recording.